A lady named Claire sounds harsh while speaking to one of her fellow participants during a drug trial. She eventually regrets it and decides to say sorry for what she did. However, as she gets close to the lady, Claire sees blood coming out of her eyes and nose. A few days earlier, Claire arrives at a company named Blackwood for a drug trial she registered to be a part of. As she gets to her assigned room, she decides to rest for a while, but she eventually gets disturbed by one of her roommates named Allison, who sounds quite excited to be part of the drug trial. Claire tries to ignore her, and as their other roommate, Vanessa, comes in, Allison introduces herself, but the new girl just walks out. After a while, all the participants are summoned to the exam room. As they get there, Claire sees the other participants but remains silent as she then texts her mom to stop calling her. However, her message doesn't send because there's no cell service in the area. Shortly after, a doctor named Burke enters the room to give the participants the instructions for the trials. She mentions that the trials will be for 5 days and they'll be given some special drugs to monitor the effects. As she says they can ask their questions, a participant named Ray asks if they'll be allowed to go outside. However, Burke says it won't be allowed. Shortly after, a nurse comes in to help Burke give the participants their first doses of the drugs to be tested. Later that day, Claire sits at a table with Ray, Vanessa, and another participant named Paul. After Ray and Paul talk about how they usually go for different trials to make some easy money, they ask if it's Claire's first time. She says it is, and Ray mentions that she's likely there for the easy money too. After a while, Vanessa walks away from the table, and as Claire wonders why she's so silent, Ray says it's how she behaves because he knows her from other trials. He also mentions that she's one of those innocent-looking kids with very religious parents. Shortly after, the participants report the symptoms they've felt so far. During Claire's evaluation, she mentions that she's not feeling any different. Following this, she heads to her room to take a nap. Allison enters the room and tries to start up a conversation with Claire, but she doesn't look interested. Just as she also tells Allison to stay away, she suddenly feels the urge to vomit. Claire immediately runs to the bathroom to do this, and as she comes out, she sees a participant named Amir who has just finished vomiting. Claire asks if he knows what the drug works for, and he says he's sure that they're testing it for a range of illnesses. He then asks if Claire is a medical student, but she says she's not. However, Amir mentions that he's a med student who recently applied for a summer internship at Blackwood. He adds that even though they've not gotten back to him regarding his application, they offered him a spot for the trials. He also says he came for the trials because he thought he could show them how useful he could be, but he has started to regret why he even came. A while later, Claire struggles to get some sleep, and as she walks out of the room, she sees the other participants inside the common room. As she realizes that they all can't sleep, she looks worried. Shortly after, Burke attends to the participants to find out more about their insomnia. While checking up on Amir, he asks if he can help with running some tests, but as Burke doesn't like his request, he says he was only joking. 30 hours later, with the participants still unable to sleep, Burke speaks to her bosses to report their condition. She also mentions that the drugs are causing inflammation in their brains, but despite her concerns, she's told to continue with the study. She then asks for specific information about the drugs, but she's told that it's against the procedure for her to know about it because it's a double-blind trial. Shortly after, the woman on the phone asks questions about the scan images that have been sent to her. As she then realizes that the results are beyond what was expected, the VP of research at the company also speaks to Burke while sounding shocked. After a while, Burke announces to the participants that the new goal is to see how long they can stay awake. She also says that if they get tired, they should let her know. The participants agree to this, and while Claire is taken for another set of scans, she gets really nervous because she's claustrophobic. She eventually starts hallucinating as she remembers a time from her past when her mom locked her in their house. This freaks her out, and as she looks scared when she's back in her room, Allison comforts her. The next day, the participants get their dosage increased, but they refuse to take it any longer since they've still not slept for a long time. One of the participants, named Marcus, complains about the sudden increase, and as the others also share their concerns, Burke comes in and says she understands them. She then says that anyone who continues the trials will be paid 30,000 euros. This makes the volunteers happy because it's a lot of money, and they agree to take the new doses. While the others look pretty excited, Amir gives Claire a suspicious look as he believes something is not right. Later that day, while the others are dancing to celebrate the increase in their expected pay, Claire sits on her own. However, Allison eventually drags her to the dance floor so she can also celebrate with them, even though she still thinks the new offer is too good to be true. While she's then dancing, she starts yawning and says she has to tell Burke because it seems she's tired. A few hours later, all the participants feel the same way, and Burke looks worried. She immediately calls her bosses to complain about this, but they don't listen to her, as they even suggest increasing the dose to see what happens. Burke can't seem to understand why they would want that. Elsewhere, the participants look really tired as they start talking about how they'll spend their money. When it's Claire's turn, she says she'd get a new place to live. Allison then suggests living with her as roommates, but Claire says they can't be friends after the trials. This hurts Allison, and she walks away, even though Claire says she didn't really mean what she said. After a while, Amir watches Burke leave her office, so he sneaks in. As he checks her computer, he then sees the extent of their brain inflammation, which shows that there's now a high risk of something serious happening. Meanwhile, Claire sees Allison sitting alone, so she goes to apologize. However, she sees Allison sleeping. As she tries to wake her up, blood starts coming out of Allison's eyes and nose, after which her body keeps shaking until she dies. Everyone, including Burke, looks shocked by this, but before they know what's happening, they hear an alarm reporting a security breach, which means the facility will be placed on lockdown for 24 hours. As a countdown starts, Burke runs away, and the participants follow her. Before they can make it out, though, the door almost gets shut, and as Burke tries to force her way through, she gets stuck and eventually dies while saying she's sorry. The participants are left terrified by this, and as Amir joins them, he looks shocked to see that Burke is dead. When he also sees that Claire is about to sleep, Amir warns her and tells the others that if anyone tries to sleep, they'll die. They ask how he knows, and he says he just saw the images of their brains. He then explains that their lack of sleep has put a lot of strain on each person's brain to the extent that it's now trying to shut down by getting them to sleep. Paul then suggests finding a way out, but Amir says there's no way out until the lockdown ends. After a while, Ray finds an axe, but as he hears that they can't even break the walls, he drops it. He then joins the others in finding sachets of smelling salts, which they'll use to stay awake. They share it among themselves, and as Ray finds a bottle of stimulants, Amir tells him to stay away from it because it could make things worse. Shortly after, Amir looks at Claire's brain activity, and he's left shocked by what he sees, but he refuses to say anything. As Claire leaves the lab, she starts hallucinating and hearing voices around. She then records a video saying she has forgiven her mom for all she did. However, she eventually deletes it. After she meets the others, Claire looks really tired and almost sleeps off, but Marcus saves her. A while later, Claire sees Vanessa trying to burn her hand to stay awake. Claire doesn't question this, and Vanessa says that even though she hasn't had a great life, she doesn't want to lose it yet. Meanwhile, Amir also starts hallucinating as he sees Burke's dead body moving. After a while, Marcus starts to hallucinate, and as he enters a dark room, it turns out he's already sleeping, and this triggers his death. Shortly after, Claire starts seeing Allison's ghost, but she still manages to find her way to the kitchen to burn her hand to avoid sleeping. Following this, she meets the others and suggests breaking through one of the walls to see if they can find a way out instead of waiting for the lockdown to end. However, Amir says it won't work because the building is very secure. Despite this, Ray, Paul, and Vanessa agree to break the wall with Claire. After a while, they manage to break off a part of the wall, but it turns out that there's a metal wall behind the bricks. Claire suggests trying another place, but Paul says they'll be wasting their energy. However, Ray mentions that it might be time to use the stimulants. Claire then says Amir has advised against it, but Ray looks angry because there's nothing else to do. After Claire leaves to find Amir, Ray asks Paul and Vanessa why they keep listening to the med student. He mentions that since Amir knows so much about the place, he might be an inside agent for Blackwood. Paul doesn't agree with this because Amir also hasn't slept, but Ray says they need to confirm if he'll die in his sleep. Meanwhile, Claire sees Amir looking devastated inside the lab as he keeps seeing Burke's ghost. Amir then gives her a note, explaining that the lockdown was initiated when he tried to copy the program files from Burke's computer. Despite this, Claire tells Amir not to blame himself. She also urges him to come up with something, and as Claire pushes him to think like a doctor, he suddenly comes up with an idea to make a methyl iodide solution to transform their brain activity back to normal for the time being. Claire looks excited about this, and she leaves to call the others. Shortly after, Claire bumps into Paul, and he tells her that he doesn't think Amir can be trusted anymore. He then shows her the bottle of stimulants, which is now empty. As he mentions that Amir might have taken the stimulants, the lights go off. Luckily, they're able to use their phone torchlights to try to find the fuse box. Paul's torchlight eventually goes off, and Claire looks scared as she starts hallucinating. However, she eventually manages to turn on the lights again, after which she quickly saves Paul before he sleeps off. Shortly after, Paul accuses Amir of switching off the lights, but he denies it. He also says he poured the stimulant pills away to stop anyone from taking them. After Vanessa enters the room, Amir doesn't understand why they've suddenly turned against him. Almost immediately, Ray enters and punches Amir before tying him up. Ray then suggests using a knife to torture Amir until he tells them the truth. Claire doesn't think this is a good plan, but Ray doesn't care. Before Amir gets hurt, though, Claire mentions that he has found a cure. Ray doesn't believe this, but Amir says he's really working on something to help them. As Ray says he won't use anything Amir makes, Claire volunteers to take it first. Following this, Amir gives instructions to Paul and Claire so they can make the solution. While they're at it, Vanessa calls Ray outside and accuses him of turning off the lights so that Amir would get blamed for it. Before he can deny it, she says she saw him. Just then, she tells him that she has a better plan to get Amir to sleep. Vanessa shows Ray a sedative she picked up in the lab and says they can use it on Amir to get him to sleep. Ray believes it's a good plan, so he agrees to help. After they return to the room, Ray distracts Claire and Paul so that Vanessa can do what she has to do. However, as she keeps walking toward Amir, she suddenly sees her body on the floor, with Claire and the others trying to revive her. Just then, she realizes that she's hallucinating. As it also turns out that she has slept, Claire tries to get Paul to use the solution they made on her, but the syringe falls and breaks. The remaining solution also falls after Paul hits the beaker, and with this, they have nothing left to help Vanessa. After she dies, Amir can't control his laughter, as he believes everything just indicates that they'll all die eventually. Claire then leaves to check the remaining time left before the lockdown is over. As she checks it, her sight appears to be blurry, and she sees the word "good night" instead of the actual time. Just then, she starts hallucinating and sees herself in a dark room. Instead of panicking, she finally records a message for her mom and talks about how she still loves her, despite how her drinking problem made her unbearable. As she mentions that she just wants to sleep, she immediately picks out her last salt sachet, which falls from her hand. While trying to pick it up, she falls to the ground and struggles to get the salt. Suddenly, she sees herself flying, but after a while, she manages to get back down and pick the salt to keep herself awake. As she stands back up while holding the wall, she notices that it's not a real wall. She then breaks through and sees an autopsy room with a door that looks like an elevator. She immediately calls Paul, and he looks happy because it could be their way out. However, as Claire says she'll call the others, Paul tells her not to worry about them. Elsewhere, Ray sees Amir's lockdown confession note inside Vanessa's pocket, and he believes Amir is responsible for everything that has happened. Meanwhile, Amir starts hallucinating again, and as he sees Burke, she says she's disappointed to see that he's waiting for Claire to help him when he's clearly the smartest among the participants. She also shows Amir a knife next to him while saying he needs to take control of the situation, and he then tries to pick it up. Before he can, Ray enters the room and picks up a small knife, which he plans to use to kill Amir, who starts shouting for help. As Ray attacks him, Amir fights back and stabs him instead. He then takes a bigger knife and stabs Ray repeatedly. Elsewhere, Claire refuses to leave with Paul, and as she hears Amir shouting, she heads back to see what's happening. Paul also follows her, but as they see Amir stabbing Ray, they look shocked. Just then, he charges toward them, and they run away. Paul eventually enters the room leading to the elevator, but he locks Claire out because he doesn't want Amir to follow her inside. Following this, Claire runs to another room, but Amir still catches her there. Before he kills her, though, she fights back and pushes him, after which she runs away. Meanwhile, Paul enters the elevator, but it turns out to be an incinerator chamber, which powers up and burns him alive. Elsewhere, Claire prepares for Amir to attack her again, but he just falls down and closes his eyes to sleep. Coincidentally, the lockdown ends, and the doors open. Amir then opens his eyes and goes through the door, only to see some armed men at the entrance. As he asks if they're there to help, one of the men kills him. Claire hears this gunshot, so she just hides while the men try to find any other survivors. As she finally gets the chance to run away, she rubs some of Amir's blood on her face and pretends to be dead as she wraps herself inside an empty body bag. After checking around for a while, the men see that the bodies are complete, so one of them opens Claire's bag to confirm that she's the one there. As he confirms this, he then zips the bag, after which the men take the bodies to their van. While they're leaving, Claire tries not to sleep inside the body bag, but she starts hallucinating again as she sees Allison inside the bag with her. She immediately gets over this and opens the bag to free herself. Before she can think of what to do next, the driver of the van sees her and believes she's a ghost. He gets really scared and ends up crashing the van. Claire falls badly, but as she stands up, she sees that the men taking the bodies out of the facility are now dead. Following this, she tries to run away, but she's too weak, so she eventually falls to the ground and closes her eyes. Days later, Claire remains in a coma, and it is reported on the news that Blackwood has been cleared of having anything to do with the drug trials. Burke also gets blamed as Blackwood names her as a rogue doctor who was doing private trials without anyone's knowledge. Just as the news ends, Claire finally opens her eyes and sees herself in a hospital.